In 1929, the cigar factories of Ybor City turned out an estimated 500 million cigars, more than 1 million a day, more than any city on the continent, and by some counts more than any city on Earth. 200 factories operated inside a few square miles of Tampa, Florida. 10,000 workers filled them, 6 days a week, rolling by hand what machines had not yet learned to make. Today, the same blocks are known for something else entirely: bars, nightclubs, tourists with mojitos who have never seen a tobacco leaf in their lives. Of the 200 factories that once stood here, exactly one still makes cigars for a living. This is the story of how immigrant labor built the cigar capital of the world, and how, in less than 50 years, the world stopped needing it. Chapter 1. The Backwater and the Railroad. Tampa, Florida, in 1880 was not a city. It was barely a town. 720 people lived along a stretch of Gulf Coast so far outside the currents of American commerce that most of the country had no particular reason to know it existed. There was no rail line running south into the peninsula. There was no meaningful trade beyond fishing and a modest cattle business driven overland to ports that mattered more than this one did. There was no industry, no capital, and no reason for anyone north of Georgia to think about Tampa at all. Palmetto scrub and pine ran to the edge of the last house in every direction, and beyond that, there was nothing but more of the same for miles. The heat was heavy, the ground was soft, and the harbor was deep enough for ocean-going ships. Almost none came. It would take a rail line to change that, and for 4 years, no rail line came. That changed in 1884. Henry Plant's South Florida Railroad reached Tampa that year, closing a gap that no wagon road or coastal schooner had ever fully closed. For the first time, the town was connected, not by a rumor of prosperity, but by an actual line of steel, freight cars, and a printed schedule to the banks, the buyers, and the markets of the entire eastern half of the country. The port that had shipped goods out by sail now shipped them out by train, in volume, on a timetable, at a price no schooner could match. Freight that had once taken weeks to reach a buyer up the coast now took days. The math of a swamp harbor had changed overnight, though nobody had yet found the industry to prove it. Tampa did not yet have an industry worth the connection, but it now had the one thing every industry that would eventually build it up out of the swamp would require: a way in and a way out. 720 people, and a line to everywhere else, 150 miles south, on a spit of coral rock at the tip of the Florida peninsula. That industry already existed. Key West was America's cigar capital in 1884, its factories built on the labor of Cuban and Spanish rollers who cured and rolled tobacco leaf entirely by hand, a skill no machine of the period could reproduce. The leaf arrived by boat from Cuba. It left the island rolled, boxed, and labeled for buyers as far away as New York and Chicago. The Gulf climate made it possible, warm, humid, close enough to Havana, that leaf and workers moved between the two ports almost as easily as they moved between neighborhoods of the same city. But Key West cigar manufacturers were, by the mid-1880s, locked in a labor dispute with no clear end in sight, one that hardened with every passing season, and an island offers a manufacturer nowhere else to relocate a factory when the workers who run it turn against him. The industry needed the climate. It did not need the island. Enter Gavino Gutierrez, who had nothing to do with any of this. Gutierrez was a civil engineer, an associate of one of Key West's cigar manufacturers, and in the winter of 1885 he traveled to the Tampa Bay area for a reason that involved neither tobacco, nor railroads, nor labor unrest. He was hunting wild guava. The ground he covered was palmetto flat and pine scrub, cut through with low, wet hammock land that made for poor farming and, to an engineer's eye, excellent building sites once it was cleared and drained. What he found, working his way through the scrub and marsh north of Plant's new terminus, was high, dry ground on a deep water port that had, only months earlier, been wired by rail to the rest of the country. Gutierrez was not in the cigar business. He had gone south for fruit, not for a factory site. But walking that ground, guava forgotten, he recognized exactly what a man who was in the cigar business would want to see. He wrote to a friend in Key West when he got back, a cigar manufacturer named Vicente Martinez Ybor, who owned one of the largest factories on the island, and who was, at that moment, looking for precisely the kind of way out that Gutierrez had just found for him. Chapter 2. Vicente Martinez Ybor. Vicente Martinez Ybor was a Valencia-born cigar manufacturer who had spent 3 decades building a tobacco empire in Cuba, manufacturing under the brand name Príncipe de Gales since 1853. The name was not incidental. Príncipe de Gales, Prince of Wales, was the kind of brand a Cuban manufacturer chose when he wanted the box itself to announce status, built over 30 years into something worth suspecting. He was not a rebel himself, not by trade or by temperament. He was a businessman, careful with ledgers, careful with contracts, but Spanish colonial authorities came to suspect he was funding the men who were rebels, funneling money toward the movement for Cuban independence, and in 1869 they forced him off the island entirely. He fled to Key West, Florida, and opened another factory there. The same trade, the same machinery, a different flag overhead. It was a pattern that would repeat itself twice more before he was finished. Key West by the 1880s had become the largest cigar manufacturing city in Florida, and one of the most volatile. Strikes shut down factories for weeks at a time. Labor organizers moved between workshops faster than management could track them, and the isolation that had once protected the island, no railroad, no easy road out, nothing but water in every direction, now trapped the manufacturers inside their own labor disputes with no room to maneuver. Ybor had already lost one factory to politics. He had no intention of losing a second one to a strike he could not outwait. He needed a way out, and in the winter of 1885, his friend Gavino Gutierrez handed him one, in the form of a letter about a stretch of unremarkable scrubland 14 miles from Tampa Bay. On October 5, 1885, Ybor signed a contract with the Tampa Board of Trade and purchased 40 acres of palmetto scrub northeast of the city, land that had grown nothing but wiregrass and low brush, land that had never held a building of any kind. The contract was the kind of document a young city wrote when it wanted an industry badly enough to negotiate for it. Tampa's boosters courting Ybor the way port cities courted any manufacturer who might fill out their tax rolls. There was no town on the 40 acres, no factory, no housing, no street grid, nothing to annex and nothing to inherit, only sand, palmetto, and a signature on a contract. Ybor began building anyway. He built a factory first, brick and heavy timber, sized for hundreds of rollers. Then, alongside it, he built housing. Small wood-frame cottages the workers called casitas, laid out in rows on streets that did not yet exist anywhere but on paper. Dozens of them raised in the same months as the factory itself. He was not merely constructing a workplace. He was constructing the conditions under which thousands of people would eat, sleep, raise children, and report to work 6 days a week. A company town assembled from raw scrubland with the same deliberateness he had once applied to a cigar blend. Every casita he raised was a wager that workers would follow him the way they had followed him out of Key West. Not out of loyalty exactly, but out of the simple economics of where the jobs were. The wager held, they came. The settlement had no name of its own at first. It was simply Ybor's land, Ybor's factory town, referred to by the man who had built it because there was nothing else yet to call it. That changed in 1887 when the city of Tampa annexed the settlement, and it took the name it would carry from then on, Ybor City. A town square mile away from having existed at all now had a name, a factory, rows of workers' cottages standing where Palmetto Scrub had stood 2 years earlier, and a founder who had every reason to believe his empire would open there exactly as it had opened everywhere else he had planted it. He was wrong about one detail. Ybor had built the factory. Ybor had signed the contract, cleared the scrub, raised the casitas, given the town his name. But the honor of rolling the first cigar in the new settlement, the first Ybor City cigar, off the first Ybor City workbench, would not belong to him at all. Chapter 3. Factory Number 1. Ybor had promised the industry a city. On April 13, 1886, it was his partner who delivered the first cigar. Ignacio Haya's factory, Sanchez y Haya, rolled the settlement's inaugural product that spring morning, while Ybor's own operation sat idle behind a picket line. A strike, the kind of labor dispute that would follow the trade from Havana to Key West to this new scrubland outside Tampa, and never fully let go of it, had delayed him. Haya beat him to market by months. Tampa's official registry made the irony permanent. Sanchez y Haya became factory number 1. Ybor's name would go on the city. Haya's went on the ledger first. Ybor did not stay behind for long. Later that year, his own factory opened, and it opened as nothing the settlement had seen. Not a shed, not an expansion, an actual monument in brick. 3 stories tall, filling an entire city block, the largest cigar factory in the world on the day its doors first swung open. A year earlier, the same ground had held wood frame shacks and men sleeping on cots between shifts. Now it held columns and cornices and enough floor space to seat 1,000 workers in rows. A building that announced, in the plainest material available, that this was not a camp anymore. Brick pier ran into brick pier down every wall, arched windows set in ranks to pull daylight across the rolling tables without the smoke of gas lamps. Filling a city block was not a figure of speech. No gap between the factory wall and the street on any of its 4 sides. A single structure large enough that a man could walk its perimeter and never once leave brick. The wage tables filled fast. Cubans came first, fleeing an island still smoldering with the war Ybor himself had once funded. Men who had already spent years at a rolling table in Havana or Key West and needed no training at all. Only a bench. From the tobacco regions of the peninsula came the Spaniards, men who already knew the leaf. Sicilians arrived last, but in the greatest numbers, filling the boats through the 1890s until their surnames outnumbered every other on the factory rolls. Most of them new to tobacco entirely, willing to start at the bottom of the floor, each boatload pulling the next behind it as letters home did the recruiting the factories never had to. 3 peoples, 3 languages, 1 trade, stitched together on 40 acres that had been palmetto brush a decade before, a workforce that argued politics in Spanish and Italian and answered to foremen in an English none of them had learned back home. The numbers told the same story from a different angle. Tampa counted 720 residents in 1880. By 1900, it counted 15,839. 20-fold growth in 20 years, and almost none of it came from the railroad or the port or the sun. It came from tobacco leaf rolled by hand, box after box, in a city that had not existed when the decade began. Inside the factories, the hands worked in silence, and the silence was not empty. On a raised platform at the center of each floor, high enough that his voice could clear the tables in the back rows without strain, sat El Lector, the reader, paid not by the owners but by the workers themselves, a portion of every man's wage, set aside each week to keep him there. The seat was elected, not appointed, and a popular reader could hold the chair for years while a dull one lasted weeks. He read newspapers in the morning. He read novels after lunch, Cervantes and Dumas, and the serialized political pamphlets smuggled up from Havana. The workers voted on the material. They voted on his salary. There was no microphone on that platform and no need for one. A good lector learned to pitch his voice, to carry over the clatter of blades stripping stems and the wooden knock of molds closing. And the floor learned to work in a hush low enough to hear him. Hundreds of rollers sat bent over their tables, tobacco leaf moving under their fingers without a glance upward, while one voice carried a single sentence across an entire floor at once, and the factory became by its own arrangement a school no one outside it had approved. The reader's voice would carry for 3 more decades. The tables under him were about to fill past anything the founders had imagined. Chapter 4. The Cigar Capital of the World. By the 1910s, the district Ybor built from a wager, and Haya beat him into finishing, has stopped being a factory town and become a fact of American commerce. More than 200 factories operate in and around Ybor City. 10,000 workers strip, roll, and box. An estimated 500 million cigars a year passing through their hands at the district's peak. Over 1 million cigars leave the neighborhood each day, bound for New York, Chicago, London, wherever a man will pay for the taste of Havana leaf grown on Florida soil. Walk the brick streets on a weekday morning, and the district announces itself before it is seen. The dense smell of cured tobacco over the blocks, wagons loaded with cigar boxes rolling toward the depot, the low murmur of 200 factory floors working at once. 30 years earlier, this ground was scrubland, palmetto, sand. Nothing a surveyor would bother naming. Newspapers across the country now call it by one name only, the cigar capital of the world. Among the men who passed through that district in these years is José Martí, a Cuban revolutionary in exile. Between 1891 and his death in 1895, he visits Tampa more than 20 times. He does not come for the cigars. He comes for the men who roll them. He speaks from the steps of the Ybor factory itself, the same brick building that had opened, a few years before, as the largest cigar factory in the world. And the floor stops moving to listen. He speaks in Spanish, without theater, to men still in their aprons with tobacco dust on their hands, in the same hall where the lector's voice once carried alone. Afterward, the listening turns into something more useful than applause. The same benches that once fell silent for a reader's voice now pass a collection along their length, coin by coin, roller by roller, hand to hand, down a room built to hold 1,000 workers. A portion of every wage, however small, goes south to fund a war that has not yet started. The factory that taught men to read is now financing a revolution. In 1893, during one of these visits, Spanish agents attempt to poison José Martí while he is in Ybor City. It is not a threat and not a rumor. It is a fact, entered into the record in a single line, aimed at one man in one room. The record states it and moves on, and so does the man who survives it. There is no crowd scene to describe, no dramatic collapse to render. Only the fact survives. An assassination attempt, quietly executed, aimed at ending a war by ending the man raising money to fight it. It does not work. He recovers not in a hospital and not in a hotel, but in the wood frame home of Paulina Pedroso, an Afro-Cuban nationalist who takes him in and nurses him through the worst of it. The house is modest and unremarkable from the street, the kind of home a factory family kept, shutters drawn against the heat, a woman moving between rooms with water and cloth while a revolution waits for its fundraiser to stand again. It carries no flag and answers to no committee. It is simply where a woman who had already chosen her side gives a dying revolutionary a bed. He leaves it alive. 2 years later, Martí is killed in battle in Cuba. In the war, he spent those 20 visits raising money to fight. A war now being fought without him. The collection does not stop. The network of cigar rollers who had passed coins hand to hand along the factory benches keeps sending money south, week after week, factory after factory, with or without the man who first asked them to give it. A revolution can survive the death of the one who started it, provided the people funding it were never fighting for him alone. It is not the last structure this immigrant workforce will build to take care of its own. Before the decade is out, the same workers who once emptied their pockets for a war in another country will start emptying them closer to home, into buildings, into memberships, into dues that buy a doctor's visit and a burial plot for men with no family within 1,000 miles. What they built for Cuba, they are about to build for themselves. Chapter 5. Mutual Aid. An immigrant with a factory wage and no safety net has one recourse: build one. Ybor City built 3, then 4. Centro Español opened its doors in 1891. L'Unione Italiana followed in 1894. Círculo Cubano and Centro Asturiano both opened in 1902, within months of each other, as if the neighborhood had reached a saturation point and needed 2 more roofs to hold everyone. The mechanic was the same across all of them. A few cents in weekly dues, deducted from a wage already thin, logged at a desk that kept its own ledger. In exchange, a member got a doctor, a pharmacy counter, a hospital ward, and when none of that was enough, a burial plot. No employer offered this. No government offered this. The cigar workers offered it to themselves. By some estimates, 90% of first and second generation men in Ybor City belonged to at least one of these societies. Historians consider it the earliest example of cooperative social medicine in the United States, decades before any American health insurance system existed anywhere else in the country. It was not charity. It was not a favor extended downward from someone with more to someone with less. It was pooled risk, run by the people who bore it. In a language of their own choosing, inside buildings they paid for themselves. A man who could not work that week still saw the doctor. A man who died at his bench still got a plot with his name cut into the stone. The dues bought certainty in a trade that offered none. That solidarity had a boundary, and the boundary was color. In 1899, Afro-Cuban members were expelled from the Cuban National Club under the pressure of Jim Crow segregation. The mutual aid model did not exempt Ybor City from the racial order of the country it sat inside. It absorbed that order, the same way it absorbed the humidity and the smell of cured tobacco, without needing to be told to. The doctors, the wards, and the burial plots that the other societies offered their members were not offered to the men who had rolled the same leaf for the same wage. The response was not appeal. It was construction. In 1901, the expelled members founded their own society, which would later become La Unión Martí Maceo, named for the Cuban revolutionary and the Afro-Cuban general who had fought beside him, a name that made the argument before a single brick was laid. In 1908, they built a 2-story brick headquarters with its own auditorium and its own dance hall. Not a room borrowed inside someone else's building, not a concession. An institution built brick by brick, answering exclusion with infrastructure. Every other society in the district had been founded to answer the same 3 fears: sickness, injury, death without family nearby to bury you. Martí Maceo answered a 4th. 2 years later, the neighborhood's skyline changed again. In 1910, a new factory building opened. designed to hold 1,000 cigar rollers at once, with the capacity to produce 250,000 cigars a day. At its opening, it was the largest cigar factory in the world. Ybor City did not call it by its company name. Residents called it El Reloj, the clock, for the bell tower that rose above the factory floor and told the whole neighborhood the time. 4 faces, one on each side, visible from the porches and the mutual aid halls and the cigar rows alike. At the top of the hour, the bell inside it sounded across the streets, over the rooftops of Centro Español and Círculo Cubano and La Unión Martí Maceo, a single tone that every household in Ybor City could set a clock by, whether or not they owned one. A factory bell doing the work a church bell did in older American towns, marking not the Sabbath, but the shift. It became the neighborhood's second heart, keeping time for a community that had already learned to keep its own accounts, tend its own sick, and bury its own dead. The men filing into El Reloj each morning were, by any measure, better protected than most industrial workers in America. They had doctors, hospitals, halls with their names on the cornerstone. What they did not have, standing at their benches rolling for wages set by men who never set foot on the factory floor, was the sense that protection and payment were the same thing. Chapter 6. The Strikes. Ybor City's cigar workers organized as aggressively as its owners built. In 1895, the Union La Resistencia formed inside the same rolling rooms where José Martí had once raised money for a war. And it did not confine itself to speeches. It drew readers and rollers and packers into one card, skilled and unskilled together, in a district where owners had assumed that nationality and trade would keep the workforce divided against itself. That assumption did not survive contact with the factory floor. Twice in 6 years, the union called the factories to a halt. In 1899 and again in 1901, demanding a closed shop across the district, one contract binding every reader, every roller, every packer, regardless of trade or nationality. Twice the owners answered the same way, not with negotiation, not with concession, but with armed vigilante committees, deputized by no one, accountable to no one, who broke the picket lines by force and marched the strikers back to the same benches, on the same terms, under the same owners who had refused to sit down with them. The pattern set in 1899 held in 1901, unchanged in its methods and unchanged in its outcome. Nothing in the years between them suggested it would ever hold differently. Nothing did. By 1910, that arrangement had calcified into custom. Owners kept the committees on standing call the way they kept their ledgers. An answer already prepared for a question that kept recurring. That year's strike was the largest labor action Tampa had seen in a decade. More factories idle, more workers on the line, more capital held hostage than either of the strikes before it. And for a few weeks, the scale of it looked like it might force a different outcome than 1899 or 1901 had. It did not. The strike ended the way the others had, but with an escalation neither of the earlier ones had required. Tampa vigilantes seized 2 strike organizers. They hanged them, in public, as a warning to the workforce still holding the line. No trial preceded it. No arrest followed it. No marker was ever placed where it happened. The names of the 2 men do not survive in the record available to history, only the fact of the killing, and the fact that it was staged to be seen, on streets, the same workers would walk back to their benches along the following Monday. The strike collapsed within days of the hangings. Organized labor in Ybor City did not recover its pre-1910 strength. Not that year, not for a generation after. 15 years of strikes, from 1895 to 1910, had won concessions in wages and in hours. None of them had broken the owner's hold on the factory floor, and after 1910, none tried as hard again. The closed shop La Resistencia had demanded in 1895 was never won. It was simply, quietly, no longer asked for. The wealth the strikes had failed to redistribute kept accumulating on the same streets in the same years. In 1905, a Cuban immigrant named Casimiro Hernandez Sr. opened a small corner cafe near the heart of Ybor City. A counter, a few tables, nothing more. It grew. Lease by lease, wall by wall, dining room by dining room, it absorbed the storefronts on either side of it, then the ones beyond those, until it occupied the entire block, seating 1,700 people at once under one roof. A corner cafe had become a full city block within the span of one immigrant's working life. The Columbia restaurant became the largest Spanish restaurant in the world, standing a few streets over from where the two organizers had been hanged, funded by the same cigar trade. Filled most nights with men who had spent the day at benches the union had failed to organize, and would never organize again. The factories kept the pace their owners had set. Nothing in the record of 1910 suggests the boom itself was in question. The vigilantes had settled that argument, or believed they had. What none of them could hang or deputize a committee against was a number already moving in the markets of New York, one that had nothing to do with Tampa at all, and would not stay away from it for long. Chapter 7. The Unraveling. The first sign of trouble is almost administrative. In 1929, as savings accounts empty and demand for hand-rolled premium cigars collapses across the country, Ybor City's factory owners do not panic. They consult ledgers they have already been keeping. For years, quietly, a handful of manufacturers have been testing rolling machines capable of producing cigars without the trained fingers of a torceder. Machines that pay an operator a fraction of a skilled roller's wage. The machines are not a response to the Depression. They predate it. Running in back rooms the owners never advertised, tested against nothing more dramatic than a column of numbers. The Depression does not create this appetite for mechanization. It simply removes every reason to resist it. The workers resist anyway. In 1931, cigar makers across Ybor City walk out in a strike aimed less at wages than at the machines themselves. A protest against a future already being installed on the factory floor, while they stand outside it. The strike fails to stop anything. Machines that roll cigars faster, cheaper, and without a union card continue arriving in crate after crate. And the men and women who once defined the trade by the skill of their hands watch that skill become optional. What follows is not a collapse. It is an erosion. And erosions are measured in decades, not headlines. More than 10,000 hand rollers had worked the factories at the industry's peak. By the end of the 1950s, an estimated 5,000 to 6,000 remain. Not a crash, an actual bleed. A chair at a rolling table left empty and never refilled. A lector's platform that goes quiet on a Tuesday and stays quiet. No single year absorbs the loss. The exodus needs no embargo, no headline. It only needs 30 years, and 30 years is exactly what it takes. Then the headline comes. In 1962, the United States imposes a trade embargo on Cuba, and with it, the supply chain that had carried Havana leaf into Tampa for 75 years goes dark. The manufacturers who remain had built their names, their labels, their entire claim to authenticity on clear Havana filler. Tobacco grown in a specific soil, on a specific island, now placed permanently out of legal reach. A name on a cigar band that once meant a verifiable leaf now means only a memory of one. A cigar maker whose reputation rests on an ingredient he can no longer buy is not selling a lesser product. He is selling a different one, under an old name, to a market that increasingly does not care about the difference. 3 years later, the demolition arrives with government paperwork attached. In 1965, bulldozers move through Ybor City as construction of Interstate 4 and a federally funded urban renewal program tear down roughly 70 acres of the neighborhood's older buildings. Not condemned structures, not abandoned lots, but the physical record of everything built here since the 1880s. 70 acres of a dense immigrant district is grocers and boarding houses and social clubs. It is corner bars where a shift used to end, and gardens planted by people who had crossed an ocean and a strait to plant them. Among the casualties is the 1908 headquarters of La Unión Martí-Maceo, raised by Afro-Cuban workers as their answer to a color line that had shut them out of the other mutual aid societies. It comes down with the rest. The wrecking crews take it along with hundreds of the workers' casitas. The same small wooden houses that a generation of immigrant families had built from nothing to prove a company town could also be a home. There is no single dramatic afternoon in it. Block gives way to block, week after week, at the same unhurried pace as the decline that preceded it. The neighborhood built from nothing is now, block by block, returned toward it. Displaced families are relocated to public housing in the suburbs. The redevelopment promised to replace what was cleared does not arrive on schedule, or on the schedule after that. Many of the lots sit empty for decades, flat and fenced, waiting for a plan that keeps changing hands. By the mid-1960s, the factories, the workforce, the tobacco, and now the buildings themselves have each been cut down in turn. What has not yet been counted is what, if anything, survived all four cuts standing. Chapter 8. What Remains? For the better part of 2 decades after the interstate cut through, Ybor City sat as a district of gaps. Vacant lots marked the footprints of casitas that were never rebuilt. Storefronts along 7th Avenue stayed shuttered longer than they stayed open, their windows papered over, or simply left dark. The factories that survived the wrecking crews kept working, but with a fraction of the hands they once employed. And the neighborhood that had been raised from nothing by exiles and immigrants and mutual aid societies settled, block by block, back toward nothing. No one, with the money or the standing to reverse it, tried. Not for years. It took until the 1980s for that to change. In 1990, the federal government designated Ybor City a National Historic Landmark District. The designation could not undo the demolition or bring back the buildings the interstate had already taken. What it did was protect what remained. The brick factory walls still standing after decades of mechanization and urban renewal, the wrought iron balconies bolted to buildings older than the automobile, the narrow street grid laid out by men who had expected it to serve cigar workers, not tourists. A district that had spent a generation being erased now had a legal reason not to be erased any further. 7th Avenue filled back in slowly, and in an order no one who had worked there would have predicted. Artists came first, through the 1980s, drawn by rents cheap enough to justify buildings that still smelled faintly of tobacco. Bars and nightclubs followed through the 1990s, filling storefronts that had once sold cigars, groceries, and insurance policies to workers walking to their shifts, replacing awnings with neon and ledgers with liquor licenses. In 2000, Centro Ybor opened along that same corridor, a retail and entertainment complex of restaurants, a multiplex, and outdoor seating, built on ground where, within living memory, 10,000 people had walked to work 6 days a week. The street came back loud again. It came back as a place for people with drinks in their hands rather than tobacco leaves. But it came back. La Unión Martí-Maceo came back as well, though not as it had been. The society rebuilt itself as a small social club without the brick headquarters the interstate had taken in 1965, without the membership rolls that had once made it one of the largest Afro-Cuban mutual aid organizations in the country. What returned was smaller than what had stood. It was not nothing. Some of the old city can still be seen standing where it always stood. The Ybor factory building, raised in 1886, is still there, the largest cigar factory in the world on the day it opened, a full city block of brick that a generation of rollers filled, floor by floor. The Columbia restaurant still serves Spanish and Cuban food from the same corner where Casimiro Hernandez opened a small cafe in 1905, more than a century of continuous service that grew into the largest Spanish restaurant in the world, an entire block of dining rooms seating close to 1,700 people at once. And El Reloj, the clock tower factory built in 1910 to house 1,000 rollers, turning out 250,000 cigars a day, is today the last operating cigar factory in the United States, still run by the descendants of the family that bought it. Decades after the strikes, the embargo, and the interstate had finished with the neighborhood around it. The clock tower at El Reloj still rises above the low brick roof lines around it, the way it did in 1910. Its face still keeps time, the numerals dulled by more than a century of sun and salt air. In the evening, the light finds the tower before it finds the street below. Catching the clock face in a gold the brick beneath it has long since lost, and the bell still rings on schedule, the same schedule it kept when 1,000 rollers worked beneath it. The sound carries now, clean, unbroken, audible for blocks in every direction, in a way it never could when the factory beneath it held 1,000 pairs of hands rolling tobacco at once, when the noise of the work alone was enough to swallow a bell built to be heard over it. The bell still rings. The streets are quiet enough now to hear it,